Good afternoon to our CLA family members, clients, community partners, and friends. Welcome back to our live stream. I am fortunate to be sitting in beautiful Baltimore, Maryland today, and our family offices here and having a great time.
To our CLA
happy to be bringing you the live stream
and friends.
We sincerely hope that all of you, as you go back
I am
to
fortunate
work
to be
together,
sitting in
are
beautiful
staying
Baltimore,
safe and healthy
Maryland
at this
today,
time.
and our family
Today
offices
we are discussing
here and
legislative
having a great
proposals,
time.
inflation, and the big ERC news for the week. We have a ton of breaking news to cover, and I have two of my favorite friends with me, Omar Nashashibi from the Franklin Partnership and Dean Bosco, who is a CLA Wealth Advisor. Welcome, friends.
Hey, Jen.
So before we dive in today, we have some housekeeping we want to cover. We have a scroll rolling through today's session of our coming events. You can register on our website, and we'd love to see you. Also, we want to let you know we will be back next week at our usual cadence to start unpacking the infrastructure proposal or law should it be signed in the coming days. We also have tons of webinars and events. And in addition to those webinars, we want you to be on the lookout for articles and white papers providing additional guidance related to what we're discussing today and what we'll continue to discuss on future live streams. I know our fabulous marketing team has helped me release two articles this week related to the employee retention credit, both as it's been impacted by the infrastructure proposal as well as yesterday's notice that we'll be talking about today. So thank you to our wonderful marketing team. As always, the best thing to do is to call your CLA relationship. We want to talk to you. So I'd like to get started with Omar. Omar, welcome back. It's been a while since you've joined us, but with all that's happening on Capitol Hill right now with infrastructure, we wanted to have you provide some insights into what's really going on. Let's jump right in. Can you tell us where things stand on all the infrastructure bills in Washington right now?
Sure, Jen, and thanks for having me back, because this is an unusually biggest August right now, busy time for us. When most of Washington normally this time of year is gone. Normally this is a ghost town. People are at the beach or at Martha's Vineyard, but the Senate's here right now, and that's really unusual. I've been doing this over 20 years. So let me set the table for you first and on where things stand. There is a Senate bipartisan infrastructure bill that is currently on the Senate floor, and it's largely known around town as the hard infrastructure bill. That is separate from the House Democrats' surface transportation bill and different from the Senate $3.5 trillion budget resolution that Senate Democrats are preparing to move after that chamber completes this hard infrastructure measure. The $3.5 trillion bill, known as the human infrastructure bill by some, and that will be Democrats only. I'll give you this background as it's going to help everyone understand the timeline. The chairman of the House Transportation Committee is threatening to oppose the Senate bipartisan infrastructure bill as he was not consulted, and the House has their own roads, bridges, and broadband bill that they've already moved. House progressives don't even trust the Senate and to move at all on some of their priorities, including the human infrastructure bill. And Speaker Pelosi has said that they will not move on a bipartisan bill without the $3.5 trillion package moving in tandem, or possibly first, is now what we're hearing from her office. But before we move forward, I just want to caution everybody that this is still a long process, and we're only looking at a Senate bill that has not gone through the House. So the contents could change significantly in the coming weeks and even the months. Go ahead.
Yeah, so even with what I said, if it should start unfurling in the coming days, it doesn't look like we'll have a signature. So that really makes sense. And what's interesting is that right now, with the Senate and all of us being focused on the bipartisan infrastructure bill, I'd like to have you help us understand where it stands and what's in it.
Sure, absolutely. So let's take a look at, and things, I've got Senate C-SPAN on one of my screens right now because things are literally changing by the hour, and I got an update I'll get into here quickly since we've just gotten started on this. But Senate Majority Leader Schumer is likely to file cloture sometime today to end debate. And what that means is it could end up getting to a vote that ends as soon as this Saturday to move forward and even final passage. I mean, the plan was to try to do it on Monday, but they could get to it as soon as this Saturday. But that vote's going to require 60 votes, and including at least 10 Republicans. And we're hearing they might get closer to past around 70 or so, which means you might see upwards of nearly 20 or so Republicans supporting that bill, and if they do move to that final vote. So right now we're unclear if they're going to be able to get it done on Saturday night or it might spill into early next week. But we are looking like the timeline as of right now that they are going to get this done pretty quick. But what's in it? Let's talk about that for a minute. It's 2,702 pages. It spends about $1.2 trillion over 8 years, and as introduced, provides $110 billion for roads and bridges, $66 billion for passenger and freight rail, another $39 for public transit, $55 for water infrastructure, more for ports and bridges, waterways, broadbands, and other provisions. So we're seeing about $550 billion or so in actual hard infrastructure spending that's going out the door over these number of years. And that's pretty significant. But the table of contents, Jen, itself is 18 pages long. And that tells you how much is in this bill that frankly does go beyond that roads and bridges. The bill is broad. It includes prevailing wage requirements under Davis-Bacon, provides $15 billion for electric vehicle infrastructure, including school buses and ferries, and has Department of Energy initiative for sustainable manufacturing and grants that also go towards those efforts. To help address the truck driver shortage, the bill creates a pilot apprenticeship program for drivers under the age of 21. And I know that is a top priority for the industry and has been for some time around town in Washington, D.C. There are significant energy efficiency and conservation programs that benefit stakeholders that range from public schools to capitalization grants for buildings and hydroelectric improvements. The Buy America and the Make It in America provisions, they're in there as we expected that they'd be, and we just had another executive order to that effect later. But again, keep in mind, like I said earlier, and I'll say it again, this is still a long process. The Senate, as we speak, is currently going through 466 amendments that were filed when we checked a few hours ago. And again, with the hope of wrapping this bill up as quickly as they can so they can move on to that $3.5 trillion budget resolution. But the plan, as I said, as of last night, was to hold the cloture vote today, which gives you the starting point to end debate and have that final threshold. So we could see 2 quick votes on Saturday and then move forward to budget reconciliation, because frankly, senators are itching to get out of town and go back to what they normally would be doing, sitting at the beach, hanging out with grandkids.
Well, thank you, Omar. Now that we know what we think will at least be in the Senate hard infrastructure bill, but you mentioned the $1 trillion price tag. How is Congress? And I know it's funny, I have clients reach out to me all the time saying, great programs, great credit, here are my questions. But one big question is, how is Congress paying for the spending in the bill? And is that a topic of concern for some senators negotiating the bill?
Well, it's monopoly money in this town most of the time, Jen. I mean, they're paying it forward, but not in a good way. So right now for this bill, though, the pay-fors, and that's how we refer to those provisions that are either revenue raisers or make adjustments in order to offset some of the expenditures. So the pay-fors, as we talk about, were a big part of these negotiations. And as criticism of the bill just really still is not muted, even on that pay-for side. There are many Republicans, especially over on the House side, who do not believe that the math, frankly, adds up, and that the bill supporters are claiming provisions that have been included in the hard infrastructure, then they right now are claiming generate between $539 billion in new money and $589 billion. And that's what we call as the pay-fors or the offsets. And again, House Republicans, many of whom we don't think are going to vote for the final package, are questioning where some of those numbers have come from. And we're still waiting for a Congressional Budget Office official score that tells us really what is going to be out there and how much is going to be generated through some of these projects that are out there. Because official supporters and saying that they're going to generate billions of dollars, we're still working on good faith until we have those final numbers that are out there, because they're even saying they're going to repurpose $253 billion worth of COVID funding for other programs and priorities. They're saying they're going to return some crackdown on fraud in the federal unemployment insurance program, recoup another $50 billion as well through just that fraud, which some are saying, why aren't you doing that now? And then looking at Superfund tax, I know the chemical industry is really upset about some of the outliers that's done over 9.5 years. So talk to your CLA rep if you're in that industry. Certainly you have a lot of chemicals, about 40 or so, that were affected potentially here in that sense. So those investments are going to come off somebody. Someone's going to end up having to pay for it, and select industries definitely are there. So those are some of the big ticket items that we're looking at right now onto the pay-fors. And again, they're still estimates because we don't have the CBO score with the true cost. And so senators began voting on amendments without knowing those numbers. But we do have a joint committee on taxation score, though some of the few tax provisions that are in there. And so we do know what the JCT has to say about that as we're on the floor with the Senate infrastructure bill.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up those tax provisions, Omar, because our audience knows CLA is very active in assisting our clients with the employee retention tax credit. Can you tell us more about what's happening with that provision? As we've read some news reports lately about it ending on September 30th. I actually wrote an article on Monday that was in the CLA website about that and encourage everyone to contact CLA with their questions. But I'd like to hear what you have to say about that and what you think is going to happen there.
So this has been a big topic, and I know you all have helped a lot of clients in this space, especially with a lot of the different guidance and notices that we've received, the changes that have happened on Capitol Hill. We know staff were as recently as 2 weeks ago talking to the IRS about these potential changes that you've now seen in the guidance that you just wrote about and you've discussed there as well. But on August 2nd, the Joint Committee on Taxation, that's part of Congress, it's a nonpartisan body that gives a number to tax provisions. We call it the JCT. The JCT released its projected tax provisions that are inside of the Senate bill and some of the costs for that. So in section 80604, that's of the bill, that's going to terminate the employee retention credit for employers subject to closure due to COVID-19. It's going to terminate after September 30th, meaning October 1st. The JCT, the Joint Committee on Taxation, says that if they terminate it one full quarter early, that's going to generate $8.222 billion. Now, normally JCT does a score over 10 years. When you look at the other provisions, I mentioned the Superfund, that's done over 9.5 and phases differently. In this one, it's different on the ERTC because, again, it was only going through December 31st. The score that's pretty significant, $8.22 billion for just one quarter. So that's something that we're definitely hearing about up on Capitol Hill in the Senate bill, that there was a surprising score that received over there. It was too soon to tell if that final provision is going to make it into the final measure that the president does sign, especially if there are further closures due to the Delta variant and now Delta Plus, and that surge continues. But I'd also like to point out September 30th, and that's an important date and deadline because many of us in town do not believe we're going to have a bipartisan final infrastructure bill done prior to September 30th. So the language in there might be moot unless they get something done prior to that, which still seems like a long shot. So getting this done before the fiscal year end on September 30th is a bit long. So in some ways, to many people, this is an artificial pay for that is largely on paper only, especially if President Biden doesn't sign a final bill until October, November, or even December. But we have heard from senior Senate staff as soon as yesterday to expect the termination of the ERTC in the final quarter in the final bill, though we could see an exclusion for businesses that started during the pandemic, as you've mentioned, but we're just not seeing a lot of pushback on Capitol Hill for the early termination.
Well, that makes sense. And honestly, what you say about the scoring makes a lot of sense to me, just given the size of the credits that we've seen both for our clients and for others as we talk about it among the industry. So that is definitely something we are watching very closely, both the timing of the bill, but whether even the retention credit will remain in the final legislation. We will be sure to keep our audience and clients up to date. So just stay tuned for more information on that as we watch it. Something else you said caught my attention, Omar, and you said October through December for a final bill. Can you explain why that's the case?
Right. And, the media and a lot of folks are really focused right now on the Senate, and understandably so. There's 100 of them. There's a lot of personalities. They do well on camera and they just attract attention. But that's just a part of the process. So let's just wrap up back on where we started. The Senate bill, which is receiving the most of this media attention, is just one piece of the puzzle. The House is going to have to support an infrastructure bill, and then both the House and Senate must together move a budget reconciliation package, because you're not getting infrastructure without the Democrats' larger priority bill. That's pretty sure here in DC. We all know that. The Senate will likely pass this hard infrastructure bill in the coming week, possibly getting votes in the mid-60s, maybe even reaching 70. Then Schumer needs to move directly to the $3.5 trillion budget reconciliation, which will not have any Republican support, and that's going to have a vote-a-rama and a bunch of amendments, possibly starting as soon as next Tuesday, with the goal of the Senate wrapping up the reconciliation bill by the end of next week. Another live stream, we can go into what to expect in that reconciliation bill, but we know, because we do know that the Senate is looking at changing 199A, that President Biden wants changes to step-up basis and capital gains and the estate tax, and that the plan right now to include the global minimum tax in that reconciliation bill. So Democrats, we talk about pay-fors, are going to need that reconciliation bill to pay for a lot of their priorities in that human infrastructure bill. So the plan as of right now is for the Senate to move the said reconciliation bill. It's a resolution. They're going to move that right now, immediately after, possibly starting this Saturday. And then the major issue you have, the House is not scheduled to return to Washington until September 30th, or September 20th, rather. So if the House isn't coming back till September 20th, you have Senate language pending that addresses ERTC on September 30th date that we mentioned earlier. Something doesn't fully align. So we have to look back. And Pelosi, we're not hearing at any point is going to bring the House back prior to September 20th. So you can start to see how the pieces hopefully are coming together. She's not going to allow, if she's not coming back till September 20th, and she's not going to allow the infrastructure bill to move unless she has a reconciliation bill, it really does push things into that October timeframe just by the sheer calendar of things. So House Democrats are not going to move that infrastructure bill without the at least 3.5 trillion reconciliation bill going at the same time. And as of right now, there's no indication there's even enough votes to pass a reconciliation bill over on the House or Senate side, because we don't really know what's in it. I think the Senate will get it through next week. So this means if and when the Senate does move their bill next week, you have to keep in mind we still are at the start. I think if you're going to have a lot of tax changes, especially in that reconciliation bill, a lot of clients aren't going to have time to plan, because December 31st, you're going to see some terminations and new effective for many tax provisions starting on January 1st. So hang on for the ride. I know you're going to see a lot of attention, a lot of movement in the Senate. The House isn't even in town to complete the full circle. So be patient. Know this is still part of the process, and we're at the beginning of it.
Omar, thanks so much. These are really great updates, and I think you made the great point of be patient. It's not happening right now, so don't panic. There's a lot going on that will help try to unpack in case there isn't a lot of time to plan, so that you can have those meaningful conversations with your advisor as you're trying to understand this. And as we do that, one of the things that we also need to understand is the impact that all of this is having on inflation. And we brought in Dean Bosco to really help us understand and highlight some of what Omar has said, alongside what else we need to hear as we plan for this and some of the consequences of it. So, Dean, welcome to the live stream. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Jen.
And Dean, I'd love if you could just start off by giving us a little bit of your perspective, kind of an overview of how all of this is impacting inflation and some of the things we need to think about.
Sure. First of all, Omar, thank you for that report out and that information. It's very timely and certainly important to all of our clients. And we will be touching on, or I'll be touching on rather, some of the hard infrastructure bill points like ports and trucking as I continue with my conversation around inflation. So let's take a look at inflation. Let's look at it, take a quick look at the 21st century history lesson of inflation and where it's been running. So you may have heard on the news that the Fed is looking to target, or likes to target, inflation at about 2%, which seems to be very reasonable and acceptable to most economists today. However, since 2000, inflation has averaged under that 2%. And for most of the past 20 years has been right there, except when it peaked right after the Great Recession in 2008 at 3.8%. Until now, but more on that in a little bit. So when you're looking at inflation and you hear about it in the news, I guess one of the things that comes up is inflation a bad thing? And the answer to that is not necessarily, because it's a normal part of the economic cycle as long as it is consistent from one year to another, so that people can plan around it. Inflation is actually a good and healthy thing for the long-term growth of any economy. Inflation becomes a problem when we first start losing track of where it's going, and it makes it much harder to figure out what the impacts are going to be and how to navigate those impacts over the short term on the economy. We've got a big wake-up call in the last couple months when the Consumer Price Index report started coming out, where last April was the first kind of bell that was rung, because the CPI index report said that inflation had hit 2.4% and has recently climbed to 5.4% as of the end of June, according to the Labor Department, which is the biggest year-over-year increase since 2008. So in real terms, if you look at it and consider it, The current 5.4% inflation rate means that the cost of daily goods and services have gone up more than double than they were a year ago, and the corresponding wages have stayed relatively flat. So in essence, our money isn't going as far as it used to. And the rapid rise of inflation also is a big concern of a lot of analysts today, as we don't really know what levels we're going to reach and for how long.
Well, and Dean, I know we were talking about this sort of before our session, and one of the words that you mentioned that I think is a key vocabulary word as you give us our history lesson, or I should say our current history lesson, is transitory. Can you talk to us about what that does and doesn't mean?
Sure. Transitory in relation to inflation, we really need to look to the source of the person that has been using that term quite a lot, and that's the Fed Chair, Jeremy Powell, and what he's been saying about transitory inflation. Transitory simply means not permanent. So what does that mean? When you dig into what the chairman has to say during his report outs to Congress, he's very selective in his verbiage, because the investment world and the markets hang on that. The economy hangs on every word he says. What I believe he's saying is that inflation, as it's increasing, is not going to continue to increase over the long term. So it is transitory. There are transitory or temporary reasons why we are experiencing the inflation that we're currently experiencing. What he is not saying, and he was pretty clear about this week, is the fact that price increases will not be reverting back to prices from last year and the year before. Those price increases are pretty much now baked into the economy. And as I had mentioned earlier, price increases and the proper amount of inflation is a good thing, because it is driving a healthy economy.
That makes sense. So when you're talking about the catalyst for inflation, I know you've spent a lot of time on supply chain disruption and some of the other things. So I was wondering if maybe you could talk to us about what those catalysts are, and then give us an example that you had shared with me that rings home deeply, because it relates back to one of my daughter's favorite things. So I'm just going to tease everybody with that, and Dean, ask you to talk to us about those things.
Absolutely. So there are three major catalysts that drive inflation. Inflation just doesn't appear out of nowhere. There are things that need to happen and do happen that drive it. And the three major catalysts are supply chain disruption, increase or pent up demand, and the easy money policy that the Fed and current administration may be taking at that particular time to try to stave off a recession. So the one that I want to focus on, and what Jen was teasing you about, is a real life example that is going on today that will kind of help you understand the supply chain disruption. And supply chain disruptions, what's interesting about them is they're not equal. Some supply chain disruptions can easily recover because there are easily accessible substitutes for those supplies, components, ingredients, whatever it is. Others, not so much. But let's take a look at that and how it's impacting globally. So what Jen was talking about is boba tea. If any of you have ever enjoyed that tasty treat from Taiwan, you know that they put in those little pearls at the bottom that you can enjoy. But over the last couple months, starting back in April, several boba tea companies across the US started posting out on Facebook that they weren't able to get their supplies. They were going to have to increase prices because their ingredients price had gone up over 26%. They were even changing their menus because they couldn't get certain things, and other options like adding extra boba balls to your drink were no longer an option because they were trying to stretch those ingredients as much as possible. What's interesting about all of that is the fact that that tasty drink that we're talking about, even though the demand for the ingredients was the same because there's no dramatic increase of a demand from customers, they still couldn't get the supplies. So if we look across the ocean to Taiwan, where much of the boba ingredients are made, things were operating very normally this year. Single-digit cases of COVID really didn't cause any major disruptions for the factories on that island. And they were able to work pretty much at full force throughout all of COVID, where other countries weren't able to work at full capacity because they were in lockdown. So those boba shops across the United States still couldn't get their products. So I kind of dug into that a little bit more. The problem had less to do with anything that was going on in Taiwan and more with what was happening in the waters right off the coast of Los Angeles. Through the first half of 2021, a rotating cast of dozens of cargo ships had been parked off the California coast, each sitting there sometimes for weeks at a time, waiting for a spot to open up at the port of Los Angeles or the port of Long Beach. This is very abnormal. The year prior, it was a possibility for one or two ships to have to wait 1 or 2 days, but never dozens of ships for dozens of days. Transit time from Taiwan to LA is typically about 2 weeks. So when you add in an additional 10 days of having to float around in the harbor, waiting for a spot to open up so you can unload your cargo, you can see that that is drastically impacting the supply chain of any kind of thing, ingredient or supplies that are coming from Asia. So the root cause was really this perfect pandemic fueled storm. As the Christmas season geared up last year, more people were going back to work and consumers were starting to spend again, and that was starting to pick up. And online shopping, as I'm sure we all know, was exploding. With limited access to things like restaurants, travel, movie theaters, and other services, physical products were the one place where people could spend their discretionary income. More than 49% of the goods that are coming out of Asia go to the United States, go through the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. But because of COVID, they were struggling mightily to have dock workers to help unload those containers. They were either sick from COVID or they were restricted by the protocol that was put in place to try to stave off COVID. So there was a lot that was going on there. What was really interesting is that started to impact the supply of containers and the availability of containers because they would sit empty on the docks and there weren't enough workers to even load them onto another ship empty and send them back to Asia where they were needed. Just as much of the world had entered lockdown in 2020, China's manufacturing industry was emerging from it. You know, they were sending masks and protective equipment, foodstuffs to the United States through those ports in California. However, because we and other countries were in lockdown, we weren't exporting those goods and services in those containers in the same capacity. We got to the point where for every 100 containers that were coming into the ports in Los Angeles and Long Beach, only 40 were going back out. So those containers continued to stack up and were in locations that nobody needed them, and they were not in the location where they were needed. Not only that, but a shortage of truck drivers in the United States, as Omar had mentioned earlier, meant that it was even harder to get the actual containers back from the final destination to the ports so they can be sent back to Asia. So shortages of shipping containers are worsening as shortages of shipping capacity is worsening because of shortages at the port capacity, which is continued to be worsened by the fact that truck drivers aren't able to get those ingredients to the boba tea shops in our example earlier so that they can continue to do business. So shortages cause shortages, which cause shortages. It is a vicious cycle that only worsens as the economies of the world, and especially the United States, reopen. So shortages, one final comment here, shortages in the economy are incredibly complex, and any explanation or example that I've got is going to be a real oversimplification, but it kind of gives you an idea of what's going on right now.
Well, it's a great example, right? That's something so simple as your boba tea that's kind of a special treat is, really can get you to think all the way back to what's going on with shipping containers and truck drivers and, everything else that goes into it to get, a $3 cup of tea in your hand. So I think that's a good explanation of the vicious cycle that we face. And I'm glad you told the story in that context. Now, one of the things that I know a lot of our colleagues and community partners and clients are concerned about is how inflation is going to impact the market. Can you give us some commentary around just the practical impact of that?
Well, right now, the Fed and the current administration are in a very tricky situation because sometimes the cure can be worse than the disease. So what the Fed has at its disposal is monetary policy. Earlier in 2020 and through this year, we've seen stimulus checks and stimulus money going out through PPP and direct to individuals. So that is known as easing money policy, putting dollars into the system so that people have enough to survive any kind of recession. What wasn't expected was the fact that this recession was incredibly short-lived. So the markets have continued to do incredibly well, but there has been very, very little volatility. So what could potentially cause a change in that for the markets from a market perspective is that if inflation continues to rise, and the Fed then makes the determination that it needs to put on the brakes, there are two major ways that it does that. The first one is it slows its process of buying back trillions of dollars of treasuries, which it's currently doing right now. And then from a market perspective, which is, very, very bad news for many investors, is they would have to start raising interest rates. And that is the big specter that nobody wants to hear about, even though we haven't seen interest rates really rise in any substantial way for the last 10 years.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. So as we look forward, what thoughts do you have or what do you think we're going to see? Not that anybody's asking you to dust off your crystal ball, but just based on all of the research and kind of the way this played out in the past, what would your expectations be?
Well, it could very well be that we are facing a new breed of economic activity that may prove to be more difficult for the same old monetary policies to remedy right now. So I still think there's not enough information. The other thing about transitory, when we go back to what Chairman Powell was talking about, is how long is temporary, how long is not permanent. And sometimes it means a couple months, other times it may be meant several quarters. So we might see these transitory trends in inflation continue on through 2022. The expectation is they will level off. They will come back to a norm of hopefully that 2% that the Fed is looking for. So at this point, what I continue to remind investors and clients is that not to allow emotion to determine how you manage your long-term investment strategy. Continue to stay the course, continue to look at your personal financial plans as to what you should be doing, and work really closely with your tax advisor and your wealth advisor to make sure that the investment strategies that you're currently in or have access to are the best ones to help you achieve your risk-adjusted return over the long term.
That makes a lot of sense, Dean. And, as you say that, what I keep wondering is, how specifically can we at CLA help with this? So maybe if you could give us just a few comments on that and just help us understand the conversations we can have and what we can do to help.
Well, Jen, you know just as well as I do what we try to do here, and our mission at CLA is to get to know our clients so that we can help them. So in that, we are very open to having conversations with clients, taking a look at what their current portfolios look like at no cost to them, and giving them a second look, an objective look, to let them know that, yep, looks like you're on course. This looks like a great allocation and a good strategy for you. Or you might want to think about this and just give them some ideas. And if that turns into us helping them more, fantastic. If not, what we hope is that we can add value to all of our client relationships in this way, because these are really uncharted waters that we're going through. We're kind of going through a COVID hangover. We were so excited coming out of COVID and no more masks. And now with the Delta variant coming in, all these kind of things are really putting investors in my world kind of on edge, and kind of having that level-headed third party to be very objective about what they're trying to accomplish. It can be a very calming effect to clients. So we're there for them.
Absolutely. And I think what you say is absolutely correct. Don't have emotional reactions to a long-term plan or make, you know, hair trigger decisions, and really just keep your advisor by your side so that you can make sure you're making the right decisions. So Dean, this has been incredibly helpful, so informative and absolutely valuable in light of Omar's commentary about what could be happening and what is happening with as it relates to the proposals and what we're going to see. And what I'd like to do now, um, Omar, as you had mentioned the ERC and the proposals, I'd like to actually pass the proverbial host mic to you, because the other bit of breaking news that we had, which is a little bit more concrete, right, is that the IRS yesterday released Notice 2021-49, giving us some guidance on Q3 and Q4, assuming we still have the ERC in play. But as of right now, the American Rescue Plan did authorize the credit through Q3 and Q4, and we needed some guidance around it. And we love it when it comes in the form of a notice, because even though that's not controlling or binding like fully, it's at least something that's recorded in the Federal Register. So, Omar, if you could help just dialogue with me so that I can share some of at least what I read in that 34-page notice yesterday, and just help unpack some of that for the audience, I would really appreciate it. So I'm not sure where you'd like to start, but I'll let you throw me whatever curveballs you think would be the most appropriate so that we can hit the highlights of this.
Sure, absolutely. But, let's still start with some background. It is a very popular program on Capitol Hill. We know House Democrats that wrote the language as recently as a few weeks ago had been talking to the IRS specifically about continuing to make some of these changes. And so maybe just a couple of things. Let's unpack what the IRS just did this week. How do you then work with clients to develop a strategy now that you've got this level of uncertainty coming from Capitol Hill, right when you thought you got some certainty from the IRS? So how do you measure the two? And then we can come back and talking about the implications for fourth quarter and Delta.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Omar, I mean, that's such a great question as far as what do we do with the uncertainty? And that's something that we've been dealing with all along with different programs. It's not just the retention credit, right? And so, what we always say to our clients is do not let the tax credit or the business incentive boon wag the decision of the overall business planning process that can make it, or I guess we call it the incentive tail wag the business decision dog. And the reason why we say that is because it's always best to do what makes the most sound financial sense for your business process, and the incentives are in place to support or recharge your business, right? So this credit is incredibly valuable. It has never been a cash flow solution. I guess in some ways it helps a little bit, but unlike PPP that gives you a massive immediate influx of funds, right? And how it was designed. With the retention credit, you could reduce your withholding deposits. You could claim a small advance credit on the Form 7200, but essentially you were going to claim the credit at the end and you were going to see the bigger influx come at a later date. So, what we don't want to do is have that uncertainty, just like as Dean was saying with like market reactions and everything. We don't want to have any triggered decisions related to the business and disrupt the business because of what we're anticipating happening with the credit. So that's how we've been advising people with all this uncertainty is, let's take a deep breath. Let's make sure that what we're doing for the business, whether we're doing some planning opportunities to make sure we could take advantage of the credit in third and fourth quarter, let's make sure that what we're doing for the business is the right answer, as opposed to changing our course of action so that we could maybe claim a credit that could or could not be in place. So hopefully that makes sense. But that's really the best guidance with any incentive as it relates to business decisions, and how we handle the uncertainty is just to focus on the business and see what we can do as a ride along from a credits and incentives perspective.
It's almost like a two-track approach. You have to go with what you know now and then plan for what is the potentially the unexpected. So develop both those strategies, and realizing though, Jen, right now they don't have a lot of time. Let's just assume you're looking at September 30th. What are some of the things people can be doing now if they want to look at that one scenario? They have less than 60 days in order to get your arms around it and then think about next steps of how they can take the credit while it's still there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as Leslie Boyd always says, it's important to have those conversations, even if they're difficult, to keep your flexible tax planning process in place, but also to plan for different contingencies. And as you said, it's like a two-lane approach. Do we have it ending at the end of Q3. We know for certain it's going to end, at least as of now, we know for certain it's scheduled to end at the end of Q4. But as you said, who knows with Delta and Delta Plus variants, if there is going to be a need to reevaluate or reconsider establishing the retention credit for even longer in 2022. It's anybody's guess at this point what the future holds there.
Right. Okay. So those are some of the strategies with looking at what Congress may or may not do. So let's just jump back then to the IRS and talk about what may have come out and how some of those strategies that you all work with your clients are, how those are certainly going to be impactful in some of those changes that are out there. So why don't you just start with one of them on spousal ownership, if you could?
Yeah, absolutely. So the notice was wonderful because it clarified some things that we could extrapolate using the code. I mean, so this is a tax credit, so it's governed by the Internal Revenue Code. All the law allows Treasury to mandate how it's regulated and implemented, so that allows us to turn to the IRS for guidance. So that's just what gets us there, right? We've used the Internal Revenue Code to assume a couple of things, one of which, to your point about spousal ownership, was there's part of this rule with the retention credit that says owners with greater than 50% ownership interest may not include their own wages for purposes of the employee retention credit. People said, well, what do owners mean? And the IRS came back and said, well, it's owners either individually or by attribution. And then they referred us to a code section that listed all the various relationships that would be considered by attribution. It did not specifically in that code section spell out spousal relationships. So in the notice, we had gone through our own analysis here at CLA with our National Tax Office and team to realize that what was also intended by this was if you had spouses who were equal owners, by attribution, they would both be considered 100% owners and we'd have to exclude their wages. The IRS just affirmed that in this notice. And that was an important thing to keep in mind because there was a lot of uncertainty around that. We were being conservative, advising our clients, what we can really tell from this is if you have a spouse who's an owner, let's include that person for purposes of attribution so that we don't risk overstating the credit using the spouse's wages or the owner's wages if together they had greater than 50% ownership. And this notice very much clarified that and solidified that position. So that's the first thing it did as far as the spousal ownership provisions.
Well, you talked about spousal ownership and wages. Can you also talk about the 2020 wage expenses and the period the credit is claimed and how the new notice handles that issue?
Yes, absolutely. So that was another key point of clarification. Once again, that the code had directed us to, but it hadn't been specifically articulated as it related to the ERC. So one of the questions was, Consolidated Appropriations Act really made 2020 credit available only by means of amending your return, your 941, your payroll tax return for 2020 in 2021. Well, in a lot of cases, people had already filed or are already filing their 2020 income tax return prior to filing their claim for the employee retention credit. Because it's it's a wage-related tax credit, there is an obligation to reduce your wage expense deduction by the amount of the credit, or adjust your taxable income to account for the fact that you've claimed this credit. What a lot of people were saying was, well, gosh, if I've already filed my 2020 return, do I actually have to reduce my 2020 wages, or can I reduce my 2021 wages or future wages in the year that I claim the credit? The IRS notice said, no, look, if you are using 2020 wages to claim the 2020 credit, even if you've already filed, you're going to have to amend your 2020 return to reflect the credit, the 2020 credit that you've taken, or to adjust that wage expense by the amount of the credit. They went on to say that should the same thing occur in 2021, you will have to, for the 2021 credit, if you use those wages, you're going to have to make the adjustment on your 2021 return. So very much clarity there that had been the source of some uncertainty as it related to the retention credit itself, even though we knew that other wage-related credits were treated similarly. The IRS made sure to affirm that that was the case for the retention credit.
Just got a couple of more questions. At least let me pair this with what I'm seeing here on Capitol Hill and talk about tips and being considered qualified wages in the notice as well. I know what I'm hearing on Capitol Hill with regards to restaurants, at least. We know the restaurant program, that wound down money. There's still 2/3 more applicants than there were ended up going from Capitol Hill. There's an effort going on by a few senators, Democratic senators, to restart the restaurant revitalization program. We know Senator Kristen Sinema wants another $60 billion in there. But can you then go back to tips wages? What do the IRS notice say with regards to that and the ERTC?
Yeah, that's actually great color commentary prior to that question. I'll tell you why. So what's interesting is, one, we can include tips, which we thought we could include tips wages for purposes of the retention credit. So especially in 2021, as we're trying to get to this $10,000 per quarter so that we can take a $7,000 credit for those employees, you can use tips wages to get to that credit amount. The other nice thing that the notice did was it clarified that in most cases, we say, look, any of these wage-related credits, we can't double dip, right? You can't use the same wages for retention credit as you would use for the work opportunity tax credit. You can't use the same wages that you use for employee retention credit as PPP forgiveness. The notice says that you can use the tip credit in addition to the employee retention credit. So that's a nice departure. And I think it has something to do with what the commentary you provided about the Restaurant Revitalization Fund program and other ways to really support these restaurants as they come back into the workplace.
Yeah, I've got one more I want to bring back in, both from Capitol Hill and the IRS. And sometimes it does feel like where these two different bodies of government are talking, or at least they're leaking and hinting to one another what they want, because we do know that some of the language coming out of Capitol Hill and conversations I've been having with regards to the employee retention tax credit also did focus on, if they are going to eliminate it for the final quarter of the year, could they possibly leave it for startups and businesses that were created during the pandemic? What did the IRS guidance say with regards to that?
Yeah, so the IRS guidance is that the recovery startup business, which is the expanded definition of an eligible employer for purposes of the retention credit. So it said a couple of things. I know the Senate proposal says, look, even if we canceled the employee retention credit for Q4, we would not do so for purposes of these recovery startup businesses. The recovery startup business is a business that was started after February 15th of 2020, and in the prior 3 years had less than $1 million of gross receipts. If a business qualifies as a recovery startup business just by virtue of those two criteria and doesn't actually meet the reduction gross receipts or partial shutdown, they can actually still claim the credit just in the expanded definition of $50,000. However, what the notice says is, if you're a recovery startup business, but you do meet either the gross receipts reduction or the partial shutdown limitation to your business, so you qualify that way, you're not limited to that $50,000 in credit in Q3 and Q4. So just an expanded definition, a little bit more cushion and protection for those recovery startup businesses, as well as, when we're talking about this expanded definition of an eligible employer in Q3 and Q4 as defined in the American Rescue Plan, Omar, one of the things that they said was, let's talk about the severely distressed businesses. And they said the severely distressed businesses could qualify. So that's a business where we don't have to acknowledge the employee headcount, right? Of a 500 greater than 500 employees, we can only look to the wages paid to employees who are not working. If it's a severely distressed business and it's a large employer, and severely distressed means they've had a greater than 90% decline in gross receipts compared to the same quarter in 2019. What the IRS said, you can either use Q3 or, the current quarter, or you can reflect back to the quarter before. So you could actually look to Q2 to be eligible as the severely distressed business in Q3. So that was, again, consistent with the guidance, which I also think is important to mention, was reinforced in the notice that said you can reflect back to the quarter before or the current quarter to qualify under the gross receipts test in 2021. So lots kind of packed in that little definition, but definitely a meaningful response and some guidance now that the businesses can feel comfortable hanging their hats on. But other than that, it was a 34-page notice, making a lot of impact. Just really going to be interesting in how you reconcile that if you have an infrastructure bill that gets passed that would eliminate the credit in Q4.
Well, you got a lot of reading to do between that guidance came out and the 2,700 pages in the Senate, and then you're going to have the reconciliation bill. So our audience has a lot to follow, and the next week and a half, there's certainly going to be a lot happening.
Exactly. Hopefully we can summarize things in a few articles, but we do always like to link to the actual legislation too, so that our community partners certainly and friends can take a look at where we're pointing to for our guidance and for these rules. So really appreciate everybody's engagement. It is all we have time for today. So I really want to thank you, Omar, for both your presentation as well as for taking the mic from me and asking a few questions and keeping it engaging. Dean, I loved your analysis, loved your presence here on the live stream with all of your good guidance about inflation and what we can do from a planning perspective as a result of everything going on with the infrastructure bill and in DC right now. Everyone else, I'd like to remind you, we are back next week. So we have transitioned back from our summer sort of slowdown of every other week, and we'd like to invite you to join us next week as we go deeper into some of these topics. So thank you so much for engaging with us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.